Hello and welcome to my channel. Vice Rhino here. It's Meathead Monday, where I take a video from before my media head was on camera and redo it with my media head on camera. Today, I'm reaching back down to the bottom of the creationist barrel to look at another video by Not a Dr. Gene Kim. Usually, I don't challenge credentials given that I have none myself, but for Gene here, I make an exception. He has a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and a doctorate. And he says that he attended Pensacola Bible Institute as well as UC Berkeley to get those credentials. But he won't tell you which credentials are from the real school and which are from the creationist diploma mill. Given that I very much doubt that UC Berkeley would accept credentials from PBI in order to get into any of their PhD programs, the conclusion that I have reached is that at least his doctorate is from the diploma mill, and it wouldn't surprise me if his master's was too. In this video, he claims that the top radiometric dating method proves that God is real. I'm not sure what he means by top, though. If I assume that it means most accurate, then I guess that would probably be uranium-lead dating, which is typically over 99% accurate. My guess is that he's actually going to go with carbon dating, because that one is actually fairly easy to make it look like it's got massive issues, as long as you just ignore the fact that there are well-known limitations with the method. And just for the record, he spends a lot of time writing without saying anything, so I will be chopping him up liberally. As always, the link to the original video is in the description if you want to make sure I'm not dishonestly editing him. So let's go!
Carbon-14 dating, for people who don't know, carbon-14 dating, what they like to do is that they would take a certain fossil.
7 seconds you made it before you said something incorrect. Well, I mean, I guess that depends on what you mean by fossil here. He doesn't specify. He's probably thinking of things like dinosaur fossils that are millions of years old. Those don't get carbon dated. Partly because of carbon-14's short half-life, there wouldn't be any C14 left in them by the time we dig them up, and partly because most fossils of that age are completely permineralized, meaning that even if C14 had a longer half-life, there wouldn't be any original carbon in them anyway, as it had all been replaced with other minerals like silica and iron, which do not contain carbon. Though certainly carbonate mineralizations are a thing that happens sometimes, but it generally happens to plants that lived in acidic environments like peat bogs, where the abundance of carbonic acid would contribute to the process. So yeah, some fossils that are younger than about 75,000 years could potentially be carbon dated, but in most cases, carbon dating is just not applicable. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't finish this with the admittedly very fun but oversimplified ejaculation popularized by Popular 54. Oi! Kim! There's no fucking carbon in it! And yes, that is a technically correct way to use the word ejaculation. Also, to reiterate, by itself, that is an oversimplification. But of course, Potholer 54 didn't leave it at that. He also explained that this objection only applies to completely permineralized fossils.
And then you got to realize this. All manner of life will have this kind of carbon within them. And then when the fossil dies, this is one of the elements that's retained within the fossils.
Sorta? Just stop saying fossils, man. Say organisms. All life ingests carbon. We are carbon-based life, after all. A certain percentage of this carbon will be carbon-14, and for terrestrial organisms, the ratio of carbon-14 to stable carbon-12 will be approximately equal to the atmospheric ratio. It is most accurate in plants, which get their carbon directly from the atmosphere. It's slightly less accurate in animals that are further down the food chain that get their carbon from the plants and/or animals that they eat, and it can get really wonky when we start talking about marine environments and the reservoir effect, where some organisms get their carbon from carboniferous rocks like limestone, and other organisms get their carbon from eating the guys that get it from the rocks. The atmospheric ratio has also changed over time. It is not a constant, and so that must be taken into account when calculating dates using carbon-14.
So by measuring the amount of carbon-14 inside a fossil, we can guess how old the fossil is.
Once again, mentally switching the word fossil to something that might actually get carbon dated, it's not a guess, it's a calculation, and one that, when done properly on appropriate samples, is incredibly accurate.
And evolutionists would like to use this to prove the old age.
Well, if I really wanted to prove an old age, I'd probably go for one of the radiometric dating methods that get us to older ages than carbon. Like the aforementioned uranium-lead dating. Rubidium-strontium works as well. And basically any dating method which can give us a date calculation using the isochron method takes care of any of the assumptions that creationists like to complain about with regards to radiometric dating. That one's a difficult concept to wrap your brain around, so rather than go into detail here, I will leave a link to a video where I think I explained it fairly well.
So in this particular video, we're not gonna debunk this. We're actually gonna do something else that's really interesting. We're gonna use this to prove younger age.
Press X to doubt.
Now you might say, no, carbon-14 dating proves older age. Well, actually, if they were really honest with carbon-14 dating, not picking and choosing like they've always done, then you can find an absolute younger age.
I mean, it's your side that's picking and choosing examples from studies that were conducted specifically to show the limitations of carbon dating, and ignoring the fact that that was the purpose of those studies, and ignoring all of the other times when it's shown through confirmation with multiple other dating methods to be incredibly accurate when properly applied. But go on.
The atmosphere on the Earth, so let's make this the atmosphere right here, it has carbon here. Now here's the thing, if you measure the amount of, if you go by carbon-14 dating and measure the amount that's within the atmosphere around our Earth, it's actually going to prove not billions of years.
I think this is him awkwardly going for the argument that, given the rate that cosmic rays are producing carbon-14 in our atmosphere today, if we extrapolate that backward, carbon-14 production can only have just begun at most 10,000 years ago. Of course, this assumes that carbon-14 is produced at a constant rate over time, and we know that this is not the case. Everything from fluctuations in the Earth's magnetic field to solar activity to climatic cycles, and that's not even getting into humans messing with carbon concentrations in every way from burning coal to testing nukes.
There's a founder of the carbon-14 dating method. His name is Dr. Willard Libby. He's the founder.
It's always amusing to me that creationists insist on referring to researchers as the founders of whatever it is they were researching. It's more amusing when applied to Darwin, as he just described a thing that happens. He didn't make that thing start happening, but it's still amusing here, even though I guess you could say that he founded this particular dating method. It's a weird way to say it. I would still phrase it more as he discovered this method, as the whole thing is based on performing calculations on parameters that he did not have any influence on, but this just kind of goes to show that people like Not a Dr. Kim need everything to be based on authority. The founder of Christianity is ostensibly Jesus, though I would argue that it's actually Paul, and that applies whether you're a mythicist or not. And Jesus is the most important guy in Christianity who can say or do nothing wrong. So obviously the first scientist to discover something like radiometric dating is the founder who could never have been wrong about it, right? Well, no. Science works in just the opposite way. The first person to ever discover something is likely to be significantly more wrong about that thing than the scientists who come later, because the ones who come later have the advantage of more scientific discoveries that have shed more light on the topic than the original discoverer did. My favorite example of this is actually Darwin. He had no idea how traits were passed on through generations in organisms, and his ideas about it were completely and utterly wrong. Because genetics, the thing that we now know is responsible for passing on these traits, had not yet been discovered. I mean, it was in the process of being discovered around the same time as Darwin, but Darwin was not apparently aware of Mendel's work, though Mendel was very much aware of Darwin.
He says that if we were to go for somewhere between 20 to 30,000 years, we would reach equilibrium here in carbon.
I think you misunderstood the point there, buddy. It's not about equilibrium. In fact, one of the creationist objections to carbon dating is the idea that it assumes that the Earth is already at an equilibrium point. But that is a false assumption. Currently, carbon-14 is forming at about 1.3 times the rate at which it decays, meaning that the levels of carbon-14 are actually increasing in the atmosphere. This is usually the point where a creationist will assume this to be a constant, and then extrapolate back to find that the Earth cannot possibly be more than 10,000 years old. But Not Dr. Kim is unique among creationists, so let's see where he's going.
So with this example, let me use an example of a water fountain here, okay? So let's say that this is a water fountain right here. It's going to be empty at the beginning, right? When you start off from scratch and then the water starts to pour, it's going to start filling up, right?
That's not typically how water fountains work. Most recirculate a set amount of water, but I'll allow it for the sake of the analogy.
But here's the thing. When it starts to pour up, if you don't put holes in it, what's going to happen? Then the water's going to fill up and fall out, right? Now let's say that we put some holes right here, okay? A decent amount of holes where the water will not fill up all the way. So we put these holes and then the water will come out of these holes.
Yeah, and that is radiometric decay. Though in this analogy, the holes are such that the water level would keep rising past them, continuing the buildup of carbon.
Now, what happens to the water after that? Is it going to go higher, higher, and then spill over?
If we're analogizing this to the Earth and carbon-14 and assuming that the creation of carbon-14 is a constant, then yes, eventually.
No.
Oh, well, please enlighten me.
Is it going to get smaller and smaller and become empty? No. It's going to reach somewhere in the middle, right?
Yeah. Only if the holes are sized such that the amount of water that escapes the fountain is equal to that which is put in. Since carbon-14 is currently produced faster than it decays, this means that the holes are too small, so the fountain will fill up.
Wherever that middle line is, right? This is what we'll refer to as equilibrium, all right?
Okay, so your entire argument is based on an assumption that not even other creationists agree with. Well done. You've constructed an argument that will be rejected by even the most fervent of young earthers. Now, let's fix it up to a point where at least Kent Hovind will accept it. The holes in the fountain have to be more than enough to let the water out, and they have to be well spread out from the top to the bottom. Eventually, such a fountain will reach an equilibrium point that comes before the overflow point, and this works better as an analogy because the more carbon-14 is in the atmosphere, the more molecules of it will decay. So the decay rate remains the same, but the total number of the atoms undergoing decay will increase. So eventually, assuming that the accumulation rate is constant, the atmosphere will reach an equilibrium point where the same number of atoms are decaying as are created. Typically, other creationists will make this analogy with a hypothetical perforated barrel rather than a fountain, but I guess Not a Dr. Kim wanted to change the analogy enough to be able to take credit for it himself, and in the process, he broke it.
Now, Willard Libby said within 20 to 30,000 years, it's going to hit that equilibrium point.
I can't actually find any references to Libby suggesting such a thing. Though I'm not excluding that as a possibility. Maybe he did mention it at some point and I just can't find it. But the person who I am definitely seeing as promoting that idea is Henry Morris, the founder of the modern creationist movement, in a more accurate sense of the word founder than when Not a Dr. Kim called Willard Libby the founder of carbon dating. So this idea came from a creationist. And most modern creationist organizations have pivoted away from this particular argument because it doesn't really fit in with the typical creationist claim that Noah's flood would have drastically impacted all radiometric dating methods. Also, the sources that Morris used to come to that conclusion were published in 1963, which was before the variations in C14 production were fully documented. Though, as usual with creationists, in order to reach his conclusion, he had to ignore the fact that the very paper he cited to come up with a time to equilibrium of about 30,000 years explained that the rate of C14 production could have been affected by variations in the Earth's magnetic field, a prediction that was later confirmed, as well as discovering other factors that can affect it. This alone is enough to completely discard the argument. To go back to the perforated barrel analogy, it would be like having someone at the tap that's filling up the barrel constantly fiddling with it, so that sometimes more water leaks out than is entering through the hose, and at other times more is entering through the hose than is leaking.
Now, do you know what's amazing? When you start out from scratch, brand new water fountain, and then you put holes, the water's going to start filling up until you hit the point of equilibrium. Yes? Same thing with the Earth. Let's start out a brand new Earth, and we start to put in all this carbon. It's going to assimilate, build up, until we hit equilibrium, right? Okay, guess what? We did not even reach that point yet.
Of course not. To reach that point would require the rate of C14 production to remain constant, which it does not. And this is not an assumption. We can directly measure the C14 content of past atmospheres through several methods, including but not limited to taking ice core samples and dendrochronology.
Here's an even more surprising one. Didn't you know carbon is building up faster? It's supposed to build up faster.
Faster than what? That's literally all he says about this. He changes topics back to the 20 to 30,000 year time frame to reach equilibrium right after saying that. I'm completely baffled.
Willard Libby, he quotes concerning 20 to 30,000 years, if the cosmic radiation has remained at its present intensity for 20 or 30,000 years.
That's a pretty big if. Actually, that in and of itself is not really all that big of an if. Cosmic radiation is fairly constant over time. It's more of a question of how much of that cosmic radiation reaches the atmosphere, because both the Earth's magnetic field and solar wind deflect quite a lot of it, and we know that neither of those things are constant, so sometimes they would allow more radiation in, other times they would keep more out.
and if the carbon reservoir has not changed appreciably in this time, then there exists at the present time a complete balance between the rate of disintegration of radiocarbon atoms and the rate of assimilation of new radiocarbon atoms for all material in the life cycle.
Okay, that was an actual quote, and it gave me enough to find where Libby actually said that. It was in his 1952 book, Radiocarbon Dating. Probably should have checked that one first, come to think of it. However, this statement is not him talking about the atmosphere being in equilibrium. It's talking about the ratio of C14 to C12 in a living organism being in equilibrium to the ratio in the atmosphere. Let's read the next couple of sentences to provide some context, shall we? Quote, "For example, a tree or any other living organism is in a state of equilibrium between the cosmic radiation and the natural rate of disintegration of radiocarbon so long as it is alive. In other words, during the lifetime, the radiocarbon assimilated from food will just balance the radiocarbon disintegration in the tissues. When death occurs, however, the assimilation process is abruptly halted and only the disintegration process remains." Now, Libby was working before we developed the first radiocarbon calibration curve, which corrects for the fact that C14 production has not been a constant over time, and his work reflects that fact. The dates that he got were only accurate to about the last 4,900 years, a fact that I found in a book that, rather annoyingly, is titled the same as Libby's book, Radiocarbon Dating, but this time by Sheridan Bowman and published in 1990. Libby knew when he was working that the assumption that the C14 production rate is a constant was likely a faulty assumption, and he never took it lightly. That's actually probably why he caveated this particular statement with the 20 to 30,000 year range for it being stable. That's stable enough that the dates that you get would be accurate, while still allowing for a variation in the production rate outside of that window. Of course, we now know that it wasn't stable in that window, but we can't fault the guy for working with what he had.
He's saying we would have reached equilibrium, a balance point between assimilation and disintegration.
No, he's saying that living organisms reach an equilibrium point with their environment.
Okay, he said right here, the assimilation production rate is 18.8, whereas the decay is 16.1.
No, he did not say that, with he being Libby. Whatever creationist you're copying your homework from said that.
This is the founder of carbon-14 dating. Yeah, I knew I had to draw this. People are going to get lost if I didn't do it that way.
Yeah, no.
Honestly, I'm actually at more of a loss with you doing it that way. And it doesn't actually matter who calculated the grams per minute decay and accumulation rate for the atmosphere. Maybe it was Libby and you just missed the spot in whatever article you're in where it transitioned from quoting him to summarize parts of his findings. The specific numbers don't actually matter here. All that matters is that this is not a constant, so it cannot be used to calculate the age of the Earth.
But it gets even worse for evolutionists, because this is a guy named Robert Whitelaw.
Robert Whitelaw, notable creationist, whose results pose numerous problems for modern creationism, as pointed out by this article from the Apologetics Press website. Just thought I'd preface whatever claim he's about to make with the fact that, once again, he's likely going to be making an argument that not even other creationists will accept.
Robert Whitelaw, a nuclear and engineering expert at Virginia Polytech Institute, found that the production rate is not equal to the disintegration rate.
Oh, okay. So you're not even going to him for anything big. I doubt he was the one to discover that, but even if he did, that is a big old nothing burger. It's not a fact that is disputed by anyone.
In fact, his calculations reveal a recent turning on of the C14 clock. Uh-oh, this shows that it's probably even younger then, see?
Is it really surprising to you that a creationist calculated that the Earth is young? Honestly, I'd be more surprised if he didn't.
Whitelaw's research indicates that the clock was turned on approximately 8,000 years ago.
Wow.
Dude, do you have Owen Wilson in your audience?
Wow. Oh. Wow. 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 Wow.
Wow. But also, isn't that still a couple thousand years too old for not a Dr. Kim's brand of creationism? I'm not sure how that even helps him here.
Didn't you know that even fossils have a problem with that?
Not when it's an appropriate sample, they don't. I'm guessing now that he's going to go into one of two things. First, he could go to the infamous mammoth fossil, where samples from two different mammoths were conflated by creationists who claimed that they were from the same mammoth but returned different ages. Or second, he could go into marine fossils, which are difficult to carbon date because of the reservoir effect. And when you try to carbon date a seal, you end up with reservoir dogs. Because seals are sometimes referred to as sea dogs? shut up. It was funny. You know you loved it. And after watching ahead, he doesn't actually go into either of those things, but I'm leaving that in because of how fantastic that joke was. It was worth it.
There's a team of scientists. It's called RATE.
Ah yes, the RATE Project. The group of creationist scientists who all got together to try and find issues with various radiometric dating methods. They started with the conclusion that there were problems, and then worked their way back from there, rather than doing the actual scientific thing of not assuming their conclusions. Also, fun fact, but my favorite creationist scientist was involved in this, Dr. John Baumgartner, the guy who published that paper about Noah's Flood that concluded that, yeah, this shit's not possible, so how about we just come to grips with the fact that we have to appeal to magic in order to make it work? Paraphrased, obviously. Let's see what specific stunt he's going to reference this time.
Stephen Boyd, PhD Hebraic and Cognate Studies.
Okay, so I skipped him listing all of the people involved in the RATE project and saying what their PhDs are in, but I left this one in because I find it interesting that a group of scientists who are investigating radioisotopes in the age of the Earth, literally what RATE stands for, would feel that it is necessary to have someone who is an expert in Hebraic and Cognate studies as part of their team. To me, this raises some red flags. It suggests to me that they're concerned with making sure they have a bunch of PhDs on the team, and don't much care what the PhD is in, so long as they can point to the group of PhDs who think the Earth is young. But I mean, they did have a bunch of physicists and geologists, so it's not like they had nobody who's qualified to work with radiometric dating. But their willingness to include unrelated PhDs just kind of speaks to the fact that they're more interested in appearances than substance. Also, Nada Dr. Kim keeps referring to this group as though they weren't affiliated with creationist organizations, when the whole team was put together by the Institute for Creation Research, an organization that just might be slightly biased here.
Quote, samples were then taken from 10 different coal layers that, according to evolutionists, represent different time periods in the geologic column.
Ah, okay, so you're going for the one where they took samples from coal that is millions of years old, and then used carbon dating on it. A dating method that, under ideal circumstances, can only give you accurate ages for samples that are less than 100,000 years old, and in most cases, can only really be used on samples younger than 50,000 years old. Now, to quote the findings as written by Dr. Baumgartner, quote, although the number of samples is small, we observe little difference in C14 levels as a function of position in the geologic record. In other words, when you date samples that are old enough that the only C14 you'll find in them will be due to modern contamination, you'll likely find that all the samples contain about the same amount of C14, especially in the samples that were stored in similar conditions. Also, let's not forget the fact that processing a sample for measurement will always introduce certain amounts of modern carbon. Typically, a sample must be physically and chemically cleaned, then turned into carbon dioxide gas, for coal that would probably just have been done by burning it, then the CO2 has to be reduced into graphite. Each step in the process doesn't just have the potential to introduce modern carbon, but is guaranteed to introduce modern carbon. In samples with enough C14 to actually get a reliable date, the amount is negligible and will be covered by the error bars in the result. But if you're starting with a sample that has a negligible amount of C14 to begin with, it'll completely mess everything up. This is actually one of the limitations that makes carbon dating best suited for younger samples than older ones, even when it's within the date range.
If you find a certain fossil in this kind of layer, then they'll measure it by, something million years. If you find it in this year, then it'll be something million years here, several thousand years, etc. That's how they find the date of the fossil.
Sorta, kinda. Yes, the best way to date a fossil is to actually date the layer that it's found in rather than directly dating the fossil itself. In most cases, directly dating a fossil isn't even possible. I wonder if he's going to bring up index fossils, because that's typically where this line of argumentation goes, but that has nothing to do with the RATE project thing that he's talking about here.
Let's say this fossil is in this layer and strata, which is millions of years old according to evolutionists, okay? Let's say that they say this particular strata is millions of years old.
Well, it wouldn't be that it's millions of years old because evolutionists said so. It would be that that was the date that was calculated for that layer based on probably several different dating methods, and in order to be included in that layer while it was forming, the animal would have had to have died at some point while the layer was forming. So the animal would necessarily be about the same age as the layer itself, at least from a geologic perspective.
Now, if we prove through carbon-14 that this fossil, which is in a million-year-old strata, is actually young, then that would disprove the evolutionist dating method of strata, correct?
Incorrect. You haven't actually proven or disproven anything, because you can't carbon date things that are millions of years old. Actually, if you have proven anything at this point, it's that when you use a tool incorrectly, you get messed up results.
Correct. Guess what? They did prove this fossil to be young.
Not with the project you're talking about. They carbon dated coal samples that were too old for carbon dating, and when they found that they all had about the same amount of carbon-14 in them, they decided that that meant that these layers that are actually separated from each other by millions of years were all the same age, and that age is what carbon dating will give to any pre-flood rocks. They used a reliable method in the wrong way, made faulty assumptions about the results, and so came to faulty conclusions.
The chosen coal samples, which dated millions to hundreds of millions of years old, based on evolution standard time estimates, all contained measurable amounts of 14C, carbon-14.
Yes, but measurable amount is kind of a meaningless term at this point. After all, an accelerator mass spectrometer, or AMS, is capable of counting individual carbon-14 atoms, so one single atom is enough to call it a measurable amount. And if you only find the one atom, given that preparing the sample is guaranteed to introduce some modern carbon, then that means the most likely option there is that the one atom that you found is a modern one.
Carbon-14, how you date through carbon-14, so I'm going to give a very dummy example.
He keeps saying dummy example, as though he's capable of giving any other kind of example. And I think that's just so adorable of him.
When you have a fossil, it has C14, right? Now, obviously, the C14, carbon-14, is not going to be in that fossil forever, you got to understand. Because remember, assimilation and what? Disintegration, right? So even though C14 is assimilating, it's going to disintegrate. It's going to come out.
Come on, man. Carbon dating is like the easiest one to get right. As the organism was alive, it continued taking in carbon-14 from its environment, so its C14 levels would match those of its environment. When it dies, it stops taking it in, and so no more C14 is added. As time passes, the C14 decays into nitrogen-14, and we determine the age by figuring out how long it would take for the C14 levels to drop to where they are when we find it. And of course, since the C14 levels in the atmosphere are not a constant, scientists need to use the carbon calibration curve when doing this calculation to account for the differing levels of C14 over time. Was that really so hard? Maybe.
Now, how it's measured is this, is that basically it's 100%. So let's say it's 100% carbon right here in the fossil.
I'm not sure if he's saying that the entire fossil is 100% carbon. I think what he's going for is that 100% of the carbon-14 in the fossil is present at the time of death, which still seems like an odd way to phrase it, but hey, this is gene chem we're talking about. I would be more surprised if everything was actually coherent.
So if you go by every 5,730 years, half of it is chopped off. Okay, so then it'll be 50%.
Yeah, okay, there we go. So 100% of the carbon-14 that was present at the time of death is now half gone after one half-life. Really clunky explanation that leaves the door open for massive misunderstandings, but since the reason for the clunkiness of the explanation is based on massive misunderstandings in the first place, it's not really surprising here.
But here's the problem. These fossils in this particular strata, which should be millions of years old, they said right here that they found all contained measurable amounts of 14C.
And do you want to know what's really fascinating about the amount of C14 that the RAPE project found? Well, let's quote Dr. Baumgartner again. Quote, "Applying the uniformitarian approach of extrapolating 14C decay into the indefinite past translates the measured 14C-12C ratios into ages that are on the order of 50,000 years." Now, why is that significant? Because in the vast majority of cases, 50,000 years is the limit to how far back it's possible to get a date using carbon dating. So, when you date a sample that is too old, knowing that there will be certain amounts of modern contamination, if you ignore the fact that the contamination is modern and treat it as though it were a part of the original sample, it basically is guaranteed to spit out a result of 50,000 years, because there isn't enough C14 for it to be any younger than that, but the fact that there is any C14 left means that it would be around that age. In other words, the carbon dating didn't show a young Earth, nor did this exercise show carbon dating to be unreliable. The carbon dating worked exactly as it was supposed to, and the guy doing the calculation treated modern carbon as though it were original to the sample, so he got the oldest age that it was possible to get for the sample. He then started with wanting to get an age of 4,200 years for the sample, because then he could lump them all in together as pre-flood, and made some assumptions about the pre-flood conditions that would allow him to get there with that calculation, without justifying them or explaining why he chose the numbers that he did, and then, wow!
Wow. 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 Wow.
He got the number that he was looking to get right from the beginning. It's not really all that impressive, to be honest.
In all cases, careful precautions were taken to eliminate any possibility of contamination from other sources. So this is genuine.
Yeah, that's just not possible, though. Like I said, the process of preparing the sample for examination in the AMS will necessarily introduce modern carbon, as well as there being the possibility of contamination in the AMS itself. Sometimes small amounts of carbon can stick to the walls of the ion sources in the AMS, and then be transferred to a new sample. Sometimes, ions that are not radiocarbon but have the same atomic weight as radiocarbon can be misidentified as radiocarbon by the AMS. Hell, cosmic rays can even have an effect. All of these effects are tiny and not significant enough to worry about in appropriate samples, but in an inappropriately old sample, they will add up to enough C14 to call detectable and slap a 50,000-year-old age on it.
Significant amounts. See, not small amounts. Significant.
Significant here, meaning the smallest amount on which it is possible to perform a calculation, and that's starting with the assumption that was known to be false that there was zero contamination. So he said that this dating method proves God. But if I grant everything that he said, the best he can get to is that the universe is not as old as we thought. Not really very compelling, but also everything he said was wrong, so it's a moot point anyway. Thanks for watching. My Media Head will return next Monday, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I live stream with Cirrus every Wednesday, 8:30 Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole. Thanks to Piper for being my editor, and special thanks as always to my patrons, who are the single atom of carbon that can be detected by the mass spectrometer that is my channel. If you'd like to confuse the hell out of creationists, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time!